Capita envisions a future in which children and families can flourish. By prioritizing our youngest children, their families, and their communities, we have the potential to radically transform the fabric of our societies for the long term. In this series of Capita in Conversation, we talk to interviewees from around the world to hear their stories, knowledge, wisdom, and ideas on how to create child and family flourishing. In this episode, Capita Senior Fellow Elliot Haspel interviews Chiara Rosselli, co-founder and executive director of the APROPOS Group, a nonprofit, politically neutral think tank operating in the field of democratic innovation, specializing in the development and implementation of process design methods for the political sphere.
So I'm here with Chiara Rosselli. Chiara is the co-founder and executive director of APROPOS, a collective of process designers, facilitators, and political analysts focused on the how of politics. How can we create better, more impactful, collaborative, and constructive political and policy conversations? And can't think of a more important mission statement these days. So, Chiara, thanks for joining us. To kick us off, could you tell us about APROPOS' political process design framework and its link to better political conversations?
Yeah, sure. And thank you very much for having me, Elliot. I'm very glad to be here. I think the best way to tell the story of APROPOS is really to tell the story of the Open European Dialogue, which is how we were really born. So essentially in about 2015, this is when it all started. And back in Europe, we had sort of the overlap of the austerity and refugee crisis coming together, which was accompanied by an all-time high in political polarization and just breakdown of political communication in European politics, right? And we thought back in the day there had to be a better way to have a political conversation than just to ask a country to sell off one of its islands to repay its debt. So that's the starting point. And we essentially set out the Open European Dialogue to do just that, to try and, tinker around with the conditions of a dialogue space and how could we make it so that it would be more constructive. And after 10 years of working with over 300 parliamentarians, essentially APROPOS is born into the formula that you described earlier. We're a politically neutral think tank, and we're working to rethink the way we design and facilitate the conditions for better, more constructive political dialogue across parties and across sectors of society, essentially.
That's great. And what inspired you personally to focus on this area of work? What's the story that brings you here?
That's a good question. Basically, I worked in think tanks for most of my career. And when I encountered completely by chance this project that is now the Open European Dialogue, and working with dialogue facilitators, I just immediately saw the different and immediate impact that the way that you design a space has. And for me, it just felt like pragmatic and concrete in a way that had some tangible takeaway. So I'd never seen that happen in such a fast way in other think tank work in my very brief experience at the time. And so that's why I jumped in on this. And just to give you an example, one of the sort of stories that we tell is about organizing, field visit to the island of Lesbos in Greece with a cross-party delegation and really feeling that in just less than 48 hours, there had been significant changes in people's perception of the problem, people's perception of who to blame. And I'd never seen that happen in such a short amount of time. That's when I became passionate about it.
Oh, and so in your experience, what are some of the common challenges or pitfalls that, are encountered when attempting to design inclusive political dialogues like you're describing?
Yeah, I think the first one, and it's understandable that it's not possible for everyone to overcome this, is just excessive formality. I think what we are failing to see is that in politics, it's a people business first. And whilst that's obvious, I think we forget it. So we address people as titles, forgetting that behind the title, there's a whole complex personality and sort of behaviors and history through which we can then connect and access sort of more common understanding. So I think one of the main issues is we forget that we are people. We think of ourselves as robots or machines that have to process information. So one of the main pitfalls is we'll just produce new data and new insights with better graphics, and this will push people to change their mind or to come together and find new solutions. But we know by now that, cognitive science and whatnot, behavioral insights, that's just not how our brains work. So I think that's one of the main issues, is to remember that we need to design for human beings, and that must mean also keeping in mind what our limitations are.
Yeah. And so can you drill down a little bit more on that? You say designing for human beings. Like, so what does that mean for, folks who are working in and around political spaces, or advocacy groups or other groups like that?
Yeah. So I'll give you 2 concrete examples, but there are so many more, of course. I'm going to start with the most micro. Like the attention span of people nowadays is pretty limited, especially if they're not 150% excited about the topic you're going to talk about. So even more so in advocacy, I think this is important to keep in mind. If you're trying to do agenda setting and on a topic where people are this is not necessarily their number one concern, you need to keep in mind that their attention span and sort of benefit of the doubt that they will give you is very short, right? So, for example, when we design these dialogue spaces, we bring in these fantastic experts, and then we often ask them to speak 7 to 10 minutes maximum. And that sounds like heresy to a lot of the think tank world, and I understand why that is so. But it is a way of keeping in mind that people need to engage with information rather than consume it in order to sort of feel some form of ownership over it. And a different example, so completely different, but I always want to give the dimension of our work, which is also looking at the details and the micro little things that you can change, which have a big impact. If we are bringing together politicians from across the spectrum, and our stated objective is to build trust among these politicians, one thing we do is to avoid handing out list of participants ahead of time, to avoid name tags that say the party. Why? Because we're trying to nudge a situation where people can connect as people first, right? So Chiara to Elliot, without it being, Chiara Rosselli, CEO of this and that and the other, and this is her whole political history. For us to find the potential for building a sort of relationship, if that makes sense. And please tell me if it doesn't.
No, it definitely makes sense. It's fascinating. I'm saying, because I've never thought about that idea, right? You're right. It kind of goes against some of these, established practices within civil society, right? Certainly here in America, right? You send out you invite people to talk for a while. You send out your participant list. Everyone's got their name placards or name tags. Like, yeah, it's very. You're challenging me that I lead with title a lot more than lead with humanity. One thing I'm curious about, though, so I guess to take that a little further, right? Like, we've got, I would say, very polarized society here in the U.S. It's exceptionally polarized along certain dimensions. And so for issues that we care about, whether that's childcare or climate change, these can be very fiery conversations. In my experience, it can be difficult to kind of even get past that first initial couple of sentences, because already, you're just Brandon, the person, right, is for or against this thing. So how do you think we could design a better political process that would lead to better policy outcomes for children and families in particular?
Well, if I may, I'll take it from the perspective of polarizing topics, and then we can see if we can zone into particular the children and family issue. So I think my simple answer is also an answer that many, I believe, don't want to hear necessarily, is that it takes time. So imagine that you are designing a conversation and you are going into it knowing perfectly well that you run the risk of breaking the room into 2 camps within the first 15 minutes. And then you basically have the rest of your allotted time, however long that is, right? Multiple day conferences or maybe a 2-hour session to sort of undo the damage that you've done in those first 15 minutes. And our approach, the political process design approach that we're trying to build, is an invitation to put front and center what is the problem. If the problem is polarization, then you need to first create the basis for a conversation that won't immediately turn into us versus them. To do that, of course, you need trust building. To trust build, you need people to get to know each other. So I need to know, Elliot, where you're from, what's your history. I need to maybe connect with you on other issues understand parts of that, to then perhaps arrive at that conversation, right? So first of all, it's a matter of time. And to be honest, it's not good enough for me to for us to say, oh, well, it requires too much time, we're not going to do it. So this is not my way of saying let's cop out. It's my saying we need to factor that in. Otherwise, we are wasting immense amounts of resources and time in conversation spaces that don't lead anywhere, because they are precisely not designing for the main obstacle of that conversation.
No, that makes sense.
I also think one of the sort of tips and tricks that we've used, which might help, is, think about negotiation of results and trust building as two different actions that sort of pull in different directions. So you are starting a conversation already knowing that by the end of it, we need to all agree and sign on a memorandum of understanding. Then, of course, as a human being, and this goes back to our earlier point of designing for humans and not for chat GPTs, we will enter that room in fight mode. And this is something we hear a lot from our members of parliament, is that we engage with, and that's our biggest project, this sort of dialogue space for parliamentarians, is that they know they will have to agree by the end of our dialogues, and that puts them in a headspace where they can start listening to other people. And we've heard that happen, time and time again, saying this is a sort of space that allows me to disagree with someone whilst also being curious enough to figure out where they're coming from.
Yeah, that's encouraging. And so I guess that sort of leads into a pretty practical partnership that the Capita, is established with APROPOS. So in April, we're kicking off another learning sprint, or like an online learning series or mini course of interactive webinars. And this one is focused on designing better political conversations for better policy in partnership with APROPOS. So could you share some insights about some of the practical tools and strategies that are going to be offered in this learning sprint that you think can help inspire this sort of optimism and hope and drive more effective engagement?
Yeah, so I think we're going to do a little bit of theoretical framing, but just looking really to debunk certain of the issues that are keeping people from trying new things, right? We started this conversation by saying maybe don't put the sort of party on the name tag or stuff like that. And I don't advocate that these sort of hacks should be the solution at all times, but it's to open up a purposeful questioning of the things that we don't question, how to run political conversations, right? That would be a first part that we hope to explore in conjunction with the cohort, and also through peer-to-peer learning, specifically also looking at the inclusion of family and children in policymaking and what experiences can we learn from there. But then the second part of the course will be a lot more practical, so zoning in on the political process design frameworks that we're developing. Our most popular tool, even though it's, there's no silver bullet for these issues, it's more about developing a posture or a mind frame, an attitude towards when you're in that moment and you're about to convene a conversation at any level, what are the sort of questions and things you should be keeping front and center, and not just as a sort of afterthought. And so our most popular framework is this sort of the 3 Ps framework, looking at how to align in any given setting people, purpose, and process, and making sure that you are designing essentially a conversation space that has at least a better chance to bring you to where you want to go. And you'd be surprised at how many conversations are just no longer think about the how, right? How are you going to get there? How you want to have a conversation that leads to new insights. Fantastic. How do I design intentionally new insights into the program? And let me know if that doesn't resonate and we can tackle it from a different angle.
No, it does resonate for sure. And I think that could be really valuable for a lot of people and a lot of different organizations who are thinking about how to navigate, we talked about this very polarized environment where it can be difficult to even get in kind of the door, so to speak, of these conversations before people have already kind of retreated into their defensive crouches. One thing that you mentioned that I want to touch on a little bit, the learning sprint is really focused on inclusive conversations. And you mentioned bringing children and families into the conversations themselves. So how do you envision the role of future generations, when Capita tends to work with younger children? So obviously some of those children are able to participate. Some of them are so young that they need their parents to be proxies. But how do we ensure their perspectives are sort of genuinely incorporated rather than just like, the token parent or the token child who's part of these conversations?
Yeah, absolutely. So as I agree with you, Elliot, the main challenge here is that I think a lot is being done to move sort of policymaking and policy thinking towards more inclusion, absolutely, but that this ends often being tokenistic, and we can interpret that in two ways. One is sort of tokenistic by malign design, if you see what I mean, like by intentions, but there's also sort of tokenism or a performative inclusion that comes from just not paying enough attention to how you design the space so that it can actually have an impact. And I think there's one thing I wanted to share about that, which is, there's a common pitfall when we design conversations that can include family and children as representative of specific stakeholder group, which is that we design finally a space where the counterparts, so the politicians, the political representatives who are supposed to be doing the listening, are brought in as consumers of this information. And to be frank, I think that's a model that doesn't work because it sort of creates a different dynamic of us and them, but the same human reactions definitely apply. So I think one way forward that we'll explore with one specific lesson in the learning sprint is how to engage in design also from the perspective of politicians. So how to design spaces that put different stakeholders at the same level so that we can build trust, so that we can create transformative conversations that stick, so that leave an impression beyond, these are the three top priorities, and this could have frankly been an email.
No, that makes a lot of sense, and I think it's such an important goal, but it's also something that requires tools and sort of technical thoughts to actually achieve.
And there's no simple solution, but I think once we start, that's why I think the learning sprint will be fun and will be interesting, because there's a good amount of myth busting, because things that we just don't take the time because we're busy and we have obviously other priorities to think about, but there are actually common sense. How can we sort of rebuild those into our general modus operandi? So something I say a lot of political process design, it's a way to institutionalize common sense. Mm-hmm. We all know these things. We're all humans. We know the way we react to a space. If there's a panel, that speaks for 45 minutes, or if there's someone who we already hate from the get-go, or if I'm called in as someone who has decision-making power just to listen to someone who has expectations of me. I'm not saying that's the way it should be, but I'm saying we need to, design for the reality of how human beings interact and not for some sort of theoretical way that we would like the world to work in.
Mm-hmm. No, absolutely. For a few more minutes here, for anyone who's interested in joining the Learning Sprint, which starts on April 15th, do they need specific skills? Are there like prerequisites that they should have to come in to fully benefit from the sessions? Or who are we looking for in terms of potential participants?
That's a great question, because no, you don't need any prerequisites. And frankly, if you're listening to this, this is probably for you. And let me tell you why. At the basis of everything that we do with APROPOS is understanding democracy as a conversation. And that's a recent quote I saw from Yuval Noah Harari, right? And we are trying to improve the quality of that conversation and to give the tools for others to improve the quality of this conversation. But this applies to anyone really at any level. Anyone who is invested essentially in advancing political thought, making progress on a political challenge, this is for you. And I'd like to finish up with an encouragement, that I take from Ezio Manzini, Politecnico of Milano professor, and his notion of diffuse design, who says, design is not for designers. And this is very, very important. Please do join the sprint if you're at any point curious. But, design is anyone who is charting a course of action to move us from where we are right now to somewhere we want to be. So if that resonates with you, this is a good learning sprint for you to join and to see that we're not experts here in design thinking for innovation. We really want to be able to bring the act of design as a key function of our democracy, just to make us a little bit more effective, a little bit more in touch with what works and what doesn't work from a human point of view. And I hope that can help us really maximize our impact as a sector.
That's wonderful. I think that's a great place to leave it. Chiara, really, I'm excited for this learning sprint. And, for anyone who's interested, please check it out. We would love to have you join us. And please check out Apropos to learn more about the excellent work that this organization is doing. So, Chiara, thank you again. Thank you for collaborating and partnering with Capita. And I look forward to our next conversation as well.
Thank you very much.
Each episode of Capita in Conversation is produced by Michael Bettis and is available by podcast wherever you get your podcasts, as well as capita.org.